Chapter 8, Setting Up a Moral System, Part 2, Basic Principles. The 8th chapter of our textbook presents the moral and ethical theories of one of the authors of our textbook, Jacques Thoreau. This ethical theory is called humanitarian ethics. In our last lecture, we talked about the basic assumptions upon which this moral theory is built. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the theory's basic principles, its rules, its almost absolutes. We're going to also be discussing the importance of individual freedom to this theory, and we'll look at the ways in which the authors of our textbook justify the main points of their theory. As they begin their presentation of the theory itself, the authors talk about the problems of morality, and what they're referring to here is the problems inherent in setting up a system of morality. And they state that the problems of morality center essentially on two areas. First, how to attain unity and order by working with basic principles so as to avoid the chaos of situationism and intuitionism. We need to unpack this statement a little bit. When we talk about basic principles, we're referring to what the authors have elsewhere referred to as almost absolute. These are the basic rules of this moral theory. And the authors then offer another opinion. They speak of the chaos of situationism, the idea that you are going to be deciding in every situation what you are going to be doing morally and ethically, and everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, and their fear that this would lead to moral anarchy. But they also refer to the chaos of intuitionism. And I would just point out that most of the world's moral systems have been intuitionistic at some level. The moral intuitions gave birth to the specific moral systems or rules, and they have not resulted in chaos. As a matter of fact, human moral intuition has led to every organized situation of ethics the world has ever known. So while I can agree with the author when he speaks of the chaos of situationism, I would take exception to him when he speaks of the chaos of situationism. The authors identify another problem in setting up a moral system, and that is, how do you allow the maximum of individual and group freedom to work with these almost absolutes in a meaningful way? So that's the task. So let's take a look at the basic principles, the almost absolutes of the author's moral system. The first principle in our author's system is the value of life principle. The value of life principle states that human beings should revere life and accept death. The second basic principle in our author's system is the principle of goodness or righteousness. The authors point out that this is the ultimate goal of any moral system, and it requires that human beings attempt to do three things. The goodness principle requires people to promote goodness over badness, to cause no harm or badness, and to prevent harm or badness. The author's third principle is the principle of justice or fairness. And they note that when they speak of justice, they're talking about distributive justice, or we might talk about social justice. We've discussed this earlier, and we pointed out that distributive justice is a euphemism in many cases for socialism. And the political theory that the goods of a culture are owned collectively by the culture, and the role of government is to assure a more or less just and fair distribution of society's goods. So they have elevated socialism and made it a moral issue. If you believe in their economic and political theory, you are a person who believes in justice. If you disagree with that, you are by definition a person who is not in favor of justice, and according to this system, your morality would be called into question. They say that distributive justice means that human beings should treat other human beings justly and fairly when attempting to distribute goodness and badness among them. Earlier, they have just referred to the distribution of the goods, and they have more or less dropped the badness from the equation. But now they bring it back in. But I want to remind you that when we talk about distributive justice, we are talking about an economic and a political theory. And the authors have made it one of the basic principles of the moral system they're proposing. The fourth principle in their theory is the principle of telling the truth or honesty. They offer this principle for pragmatic reasons because it follows from the need to be fair and just in dealing with others. And they're going to unpack that a little more. But the basic idea is you're not going to have much of a culture if you don't have a basic level of truth-telling going on in that culture. If honesty is not a standard towards which people aspire in at least a general way, then how are you going to carry on commerce? How are you going to have a civilization that coheres, that sticks together? The final basic principle, or almost absolute in the author system, is the principle of freedom. Now, this is stated as an almost absolute, but it is in fact the one absolute in the author's system, and we'll be discussing this further. But they justify this principle by saying each individual is the only one truly able to decide what is good for himself. That is a proposition that is either true or false, and that puts the proposition in the category of not near absolutes, but absolutes. This is a statement that is either true or false. So we'll be talking about that. This is actually the foundational principle of the author's system. Now, the authors give a priority to their basic principles or their almost absolutes. They begin by telling us there are two ways of establishing the priority for their moral principles. In the first or general way, they suggest that we classify their moral principles into two categories based on logical or empirical priority. So Moses came down from Mount Sinai with 2 tablets upon which were the 10 commandments. Thoreau has come down from the mountain with 2 tablets as well. And on these 2 tablets, he has his basic principles, his almost absolutes, his thou must almost always, if you will. So what is the priority? Let's take a look at Thoreau's 2 tablets of almost absolutes. On the first tablet, we find the first category of almost absolutes, and these are those he believes logically and empirically to be before the others. He begins with his value of life principle, that human beings should revere life, but accept death. And he believes this is the most important priority, and logically the first priority, because without life there can be no morality whatsoever. Now that makes some sense. If we're all dead, then morality is a discussion that is never held. And so he is suggesting that all human life needs to be revered, but there comes a time when death has to be accepted. We pointed out when discussing his arguments for the value of life principle that he may have demonstrated that some human life is valuable and worth preserving, but he did not logically prove that all human life is worth preserving. And I would say that logically that is a problem with his system. But we'll critique things later. Right now let's just talk about his first category of almost absolutes. The second item on this tablet of his law is the principle of goodness. And because, as he stated, this is the ultimate goal, the ultimate principle of any moral system. All moral systems are attempting to promote goodness over badness. And so he suggests that logically and empirically, that would be the second priority in his moral and ethical system. Now we look at the second tablet of Thoreau's laws, or almost absolutes, or let's just call them what he calls them basic principles. Now let's take a look at the second tablet of Thoreau's system. The principle of justice and fairness is the third priority in his system. And remind you that when he is speaking of justice, he is speaking of distributive justice. His theory of justice includes both an economic and a political theory, which has been elevated now and made a moral issue. He argues that this principle of justice or fairness should be the third priority in his system of morality because, quote, in most human actions, more than just one person is involved, and some form of distribution of goodness and badness must be established. Now, this is actually a proposition, and you remember, propositions are either true or false. You don't get a general theory when you have answered the question posed to you by a declarative sentence, by a proposition. And so the justice and fairness principle has the force then of a moral absolute because you don't see any flexibility here. And remember, the author wanted a system in which the rules are flexible. But where's the flexibility here? He is insisting that you have to have a form of distribution over badness. It must be established when you have two human beings get together. But does distributive justice have to be that theory of distribution accepted by a society in order for that society to be truly just? Or is that just something the author assumes? The fourth priority in the author system is telling the truth or honesty. And we've mentioned this. It's pragmatic. It follows from the need to be fair and just in one's dealings with others. So in order to have a society that adheres, has enough glue to work, you're going to have people aspire to some degree of personal integrity when it comes to this matter of telling the truth. And finally, he lists as his fifth priority individual freedom. But we'll see very shortly that this is absolutely the foundation of his theory, and it is absolutely an absolute. What is the freedom principle? It is the idea that other than the other four almost absolutes discussed, every individual decides for him or herself what is good for him or herself. And again, this is a proposition because each individual is the only one truly able to decide what is good for himself. Now let's go back to the who says so problem we've discussed. Nietzsche raised the question, if God is dead, who is going to fill his shoes? The obvious answer to that is some human being or some collective group of human beings is going to have to occupy the place that has formerly been occupied by God in the Western world. In the author's system, the answer to the who says so problem is you. You get to be God in all but 4 general matters. In those 4 general matters, society gets to be God. When it comes to the distribution of the goods, society gets to be God. Society is going to hold you accountable to be more or less honest, unless there is some extraordinary reason why you should not tell the truth. Society is going to insist that you revere life, but society may also require you to accept death at a certain point in time. And so you see, society is going to insist on 4 basic principles. But in every other life decision, in every other moral matter, you get to be God. Quite appealing. Now, on page 115, the authors make a troubling statement. And in this statement, we discover that their principle 5 is actually the foundation upon which their entire theory rests. The author writes, "One person should not condemn another person for the way he or she lives, no matter how great the difference in lifestyle, as long as both people adhere to the principles of goodness, justice, value of life, and honesty." This again is a proposition. It is an assertion, and it is the summary of the author's moral theory. The authors are proposing 4 basic principles, almost absolute: goodness, though that isn't defined; justice, value of life, and honesty. Other than that, as we have pointed out, the person chooses for themselves the moral rules that they're going to follow. Well, obviously, you're going to have a certain degree of moral anarchy within the confines of the 4 basic principles. What do you do then when you have people with conflicting lifestyles? People who have made different choices for themselves. The author has introduced here the principle of tolerance. You must tolerate whatever moral choices another person makes. You cannot condemn them, no matter how different their moral choices are from your moral choices, as long as they are basically a good person. Well, how is that defined? Well, they promote goodness over badness. How is that defined? Well, that is defined, it's very deliberately left undefined by our authors because they recognize that that's going to change. So whatever a culture happens to believe to be right or wrong, good or bad, at a particular moment in its moral evolution, that is the goodness that a good person accepts. And that would include his principle of tolerance, of course. As long as you are basically a socialist and you believe that government's responsibility is the more or less fair distribution of goods, the value of life principle, you're basically honest, you're a good person. And as long as a person is good, as defined by his 4 almost absolutes, anything goes, except intolerance. Now, in making this assertions, I want you to notice the authors are declaring, not empirically demonstrating or rationally arguing. They're asserting, making a declarative sentence. And in this declaration, they are declaring a new right and a new wrong. If we accept the author's assertion on page 151, Accepting becomes the new good. Rejecting becomes the new wrong. The author's assertion on page 151 that it is morally wrong not to accept another person's lifestyle choices, no matter how different they may be from ours, so long as they adhere to the 4 basic principles. Does this new good require us to do more than just tolerate another person's moral choices? And tolerate used to mean put up with. It was the idea, I think you're wrong, but I'm going to give you the right to live. I'm not going to kill you because we disagree. That was the most basic form of tolerance. Coexistence. You believe what you believe. I believe what I believe. I don't appreciate or agree with what you're doing, but I'm going to, teach their own. We'll coexist in this culture. But tolerance has now been defined as never condemning and accepting. But doesn't that actually require us to affirm or approve of another person's choice, no matter how greatly the differences in lifestyle? The word affirm, if you're not used to using it in conversation, means that I have to say your choice is as good as mine. I have no basis for condemning you because in the area of moral choices other than the big 4, everyone is free to decide for themselves. They're the only one that can decide for themselves. And so doesn't the new good require us to say that every moral choice is equally valid? That every lifestyle following from a moral choice is equally valid? To use an extreme example, wouldn't that require us to say that the person who is into bestiality and having a meaningful relationship with his dog, that relationship is just as valid, that moral choice, that different lifestyle is just as valid as any other, so long as that person is honest about it and is generally promoting good over bad and is, into social justice. Who am I to condemn him for his relationship with his German Shepherd? There's another problem with the author's assertion. How does the author's insistence that one person should not condemn another person for the way he or she lives, no matter how great the differences in lifestyle, as long as both people adhere to his big 4 principles, how does that square with his assumption that a workable system of morality must aim at universality or general application to all humanity? Because let me tell you, other than the very secular West, not everyone is going to buy into this idea that every moral choice and every lifestyle choice is equally valid. The 16.2% of the world that is secular in its orientation might say, okay, yeah, that sounds good to us. But this is going to be difficult to fly in, say, the Islamic world. As a matter of fact, the Islamic world might look at us and say, that's one of the reasons we refer to you in the United States as the great Satan. And that's one of the reasons that the radicals among us are waging jihad. Because what you find acceptable, we find revolting. And we will not accept what we believe to be your moral corruption. Now, I'm not suggesting that they are necessarily right in their evaluation of the West. The majority of the world, that majority could be wrong. But I'm suggesting that if your ultimate aim is universality, I'm not sure that the author's freedom principle cuts it. Another question. All of the world's great religions do not accept the morality of every lifestyle choice. They condemn certain things. So, does humanitarian ethics imply that all of the world's great religions are wrong? Now, you can find some of the world's religions that are open to some of the things that we in the West think are fine. Certain Oriental religions would be certainly much more flexible in their sexual mores than we are in the West. Nevertheless, the majority of the world's religions would look at the range of lifestyle choices that we consider acceptable here in the West, and they would condemn many of those. Even the indigenous religions, religions that are indigenous to the West, our Judeo-Christian religious tradition would not accept every lifestyle choice as moral. And they would condemn certain things. So, does that mean that they are wrong? What I'm asking is the author's freedom principle fundamentally anti-religious? Or at least against the moral teachings of the major religions of the world? And I would suggest that the answer to that question is yes, indeed. Accepted at face value, the author's moral system, resting as it does upon his freedom principle, condemns something. It condemns all the religions of the world, which is very interesting. We have a system that says you cannot condemn individuals for their lifestyle choices, but it would make it valid for individuals to condemn any religious-based moral system. You see, the authors are advocating a moral system here that presupposes certain things. The author system presupposes that morals are autonomous. That means they're independent. They are not connected to anything absolute, and that they're individualistic. That other than a few general rules, every individual is his or her own lawgiver. Now, this may sound like a good idea to you, and certainly you can accept the author's arguments. After all, they've written the textbook, I haven't. But I just want to note that the author's opinion represents a major departure from history, and it is an affront to the moral standards of the majority of the world. We used to refer to the majority of the world as the developing world or the third world. The preferred term today is the majority world. And in this term, we are reminded that we are outnumbered by people who live in other cultures, and these other cultures are traditional cultures. Remember, in philosophy, traditional is kind of a synonym for religious-based, spiritual-based cultures. And so the authors are arguing for a departure and a moving away from traditional morality. That is a huge, huge proposition. And the model they are proposing is not only different from what the majority world believes, but it is an absolute affront to what the majority of the world believes, because the majority of the world is increasingly religious, as both Islam and Christianity are growing exponentially in the majority world. Now, to help put this in perspective, I'm going to be bringing in something here from another class I teach at Colby Community College. My world religion class, again, that's my area of expertise, is philosophy of religion. And I want to talk about taboos. A taboo is a rule that forbids specific behavior with regard to certain objects, people, animals, days, phases of life, and so forth. In an industrial culture, we have law. In a culture that does not have a written language, perhaps a tribal community, you don't have written laws. Your laws are the taboos of the tribe. Now, these taboos are connected to the tribal religion, and they're intended to protect the individual and the group and preserve or safeguard the natural order of things. So when these taboos are put in place and enforced in various ways in a tribal community, the elders of the community are not trying to be mean. They're not trying to prevent people from enjoying something good. The purpose of the rules is to protect the individual and to protect the tribe and to keep things operating within the tribe with a cultural equilibrium that is that prevents chaos, it prevents conflict, so that the tribal community continues to enjoy harmony among themselves, and as a result of that, the tribe continues to exist. Now, in a tribal community, there are many taboos against antisocial behavior. The society, of course, everyone living together, they have their taboos, which would be their laws, and there are always those who would either accidentally or sometimes deliberately break the rules of the society. And so the taboos are there to discourage people from doing this. So there are strong taboos against adultery, certain sexual behaviors, and stealing. Now, think of this in a tribal context, and it makes a lot of sense. Nothing is going to cause conflict in a community more than adultery. And so there is generally a taboo against adultery in a tribal community. Now, there are some tribal communities in which a chief, for example, would allow a guest to have relations with one of his wives, but for you to initiate that on your own would be the breaking of a taboo. And those sorts of cultures are relatively rare. For the most part, the sanctity of marriage, the sanctity of the family circle is something that is protected by taboo in most cultures. Sexual behaviors, well, here in the West, especially since the sexual revolution, anything goes. But in a tribal community, a sexual disease could spell the end of the tribe. And so taboos against promiscuity make some sense in that tribal setting just from a pragmatic standpoint. And stealing, there are some tribes that are very communal. There's no such thing as stealing because everything is viewed as being owned by the tribe. But in cultures where there is the private ownership of at least some property, the stealing of another person's property is forbidden, and there are taboos against that sort of thing. Now, these taboos are enforced. When someone violates the standards of the culture through some antisocial behavior, the tribe has to deal with it. They don't have prisons, so what do? Well, there would first be a warning. If that doesn't work, there would often be shunning. Everyone in the tribe would pretend that other person does not exist. And you can imagine how that might bring you back into line. But if that doesn't work, they kick you off the island, or they kick you off of the glacier. And in many cases, to be an individual means you die, because being part of a community is necessary for your survival in an environment that is very unfriendly to individual human life. And so this is how things are dealt with at the tribal level. And we look at this taboo system, and we would perhaps look at it and say, well, this is very, very primitive, very unlike ours. It really isn't. When you stop and think about it, technologically advanced cultures may not fear evil spirits anymore. And many of them do not fear God anymore either. When a hurricane hits, you'll get in big trouble if you say that is the wrath of God. But no matter what the belief system, society has always seen the need to protect itself from the antisocial. Society has always seen the need to protect the natural order of things. In tribal communities, they have the taboo system. In industrial societies, we have a complex web of laws and regulations. But our laws and regulations, though we decide on these things differently than in a hunter-gatherer culture, a different way of making the rules, but they serve the same function as taboos. So indigenous cultures are not alone when it comes to taboos. We call them by a different name, but every culture has its taboos. Now, like indigenous cultures, technologically advanced cultures have to deal with those antisocial individuals who violate the cultural taboos. In some cases, the violations are so serious that we send the violators to prison, or we can even take their life, depending on what state you happen to live in. But not every violation of a cultural taboo rises to the level of illegality. And it's interesting to note that we deal with those violations the same way they're dealt with in indigenous cultures. We warn the person who is violating the rules. If that continues, we shun that person. We avoid that person. We may kick them off of our social island. They may be out of the club. They may be off the team. People are pretty much the same everywhere. We are just perhaps more sophisticated, but we have our taboos, and we deal with the violators of our taboos just the same as they're dealt with in other cultural situations. Now, this raises a question with respect to our author's freedom principle. The question is this: does a society have a right to a public morality as opposed to private individualistic morality? The authors say we must have this broad acceptance of individualism, individual moral choices. Are the authors saying that we need to? Is that what they're suggesting? Or are they proposing that we change our taboos? That we exchange our culture's traditional taboos for a new set of taboos? I want to suggest that that is exactly what the authors of our textbook are suggesting. Before I give that argument, I want you to consider again this statement that we have referred to several times. Take a look at it. One person should not condemn another person for the way he or she lives, no matter how great the differences in lifestyle, as long as both people adhere to the principles of goodness, justice, value of life, and honesty. You have that kind of clearly in your mind? Now here's the proposal. Every system of morality, including the one being proposed by the authors of our textbook, defines good and bad. It defines what is social and what is antisocial. And it does this not in some abstract sense, but in a very real and a very practical sense. Good individuals in any ethical system are those who embrace and obey the rules. And bad individuals are those who reject and disobey the rules. Let's consider for just a second the old divine rule system. A good individual was a person who agreed with the Ten Commandments and endeavored to obey them. A bad individual was a person who rejected those commandments as good and then disobeyed the rules. So the system defined good and bad, right and wrong, and as that system came to be the system that governed society, the rules defined social and antisocial behavior in a very real and a very practical way. In the final analysis, a new system morality does not eliminate taboos. It creates them. It does this by replacing the old taboos with new ones. Now let's consider the author system. Very ambitiously, the authors are offering a new moral theory that they believe will work for most, if not all, of the people in the world. So we have to ask the question, how does this new system jive with the taboos of most, if not all, of the people of the world? How does it jive with the taboos in the Islamic world, or the Hindu world, or the Buddhist world? And how does it jive with the moral theories still held to by many people in a country such as the United States? Does it work with the existing taboos? I think we pointed out that this new theory does not jive with the existing taboos. It is, in fact, suggesting that we get rid of them because traditional morality condemns many lifestyle choices, and the new system says we must not do that as long as people hold to a basic, simple set of broad principles. So, this new system is going to require the elimination of all previously existing taboos against certain lifestyle choices. And it is going to create some new social rules. The question is, who are the good guys going to be in this new system, and who are the bad guys going to be? Remember, the good guys are those who embrace the system and obey its rules. And the bad guys are those who would reject the system and disobey its rules. So what I'm arguing here is that it's ridiculous to say, as our authors have said, that one person should not condemn another person for the way he or she lives. Because we human beings are always going to condemn those who don't keep society's rules, whatever those rules happen to be. So if the new rule is tolerance, who are the new villains? Well, by definition, they're the intolerant. The good guys are the tolerant, those who affirm, as well as accept every other person's lifestyle choice. And the new villains are those who refuse to do that. Now, in extreme cases, antisocial behavior is dealt with through the force of law. We've talked about that. Our culture has outlawed, and it punishes the most egregious wrongdoers. And who is a wrongdoer? Those who break the rules of the system. How are we going to deal with those who break the new rules? What are we going to do about those who are intolerant? I would suggest that in the less extreme cases, society will deal with the new antisocial the same way they have dealt with antisocial people in other cultural settings. They will warn them that their attitude, their words are politically incorrect. They will shun them, and they will then expel them. And the word for this that I think would work in an industrial culture would be they will marginalize these individuals. They will push them to the edge of society as part of a group that we malign and condemn. Here's the point. In the final analysis, a culture that says thou shalt not condemn will not eliminate condemnation. It will just identify a new group of people worthy of condemnation. Ironically, in the author system, the new group worthy of condemnation are those individuals who were considered moral in a more traditional culture. So, humanitarian ethics seeks to offer us an eclectic approach to ethics. Mixed deontological ethics, combining consequentialist, non-consequentialist perspectives, solving the act rule problem, a different approach to morality. And according to the authors of our textbook, the value of life principle was arrived at through logical empiricism. But I want you to note that their goodness over badness principle is based on the assumption that we know the difference between the two, that it's self-obvious. Again, they never defined it, but their system does. Goodness and badness is going to be defined by the system being proposed. And we've talked about some of the consequences of that when we consider the author's freedom principle. The author's principle of justice and fairness is certainly utilitarian, since it focuses on distributive justice rather than retributive justice. Retributive justice, again, has as its foundation principle that people receive the good or bad that they have earned or deserve. Distributive justice says that people receive a fair and just share of society's goods. Just point out again that the authors have elevated an economic theory and a political theory and made it a moral issue. So that if you are a socialist, you are moral, and if you are a free marketeer, by definition, your perspective is anti-social and immoral. You may agree with that. I just want to point out where the authors are coming from. The honesty principle, as we pointed out, is completely pragmatic. It works. And the authors are saying that no system of morality is going to work in a practical way unless there is some basic level of honesty. So we're being honest not because we see that as a moral virtue, but because we see it as something that is a necessary thing, perhaps even a necessary evil. I would rather not be honest, but I have to work in this marketplace, and so it's to my practical advantage to tell the truth. And then the freedom principle. The authors have rejected moral relativism, and their four almost absolutes do put some boundaries on the human tendency to be a moral relativist and decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. But the author system is really semi-moral relativism. It is relativism with a few flexible boundaries. So that's my analysis of humanitarian ethics. Be interested perhaps in a time of discussion, hearing what you think.